There is a detail buried deep in the opening lines of the birth narrative. A detail so politically charged, so historically loaded, that most people read past it without pausing. A decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered, all the world. Not a village, not a province, not a nation, the world. That phrase alone tells you something about the man behind it. Something about the moment in history into which a child would be born in a stable in Bethlehem, while the most powerful man alive sat on a throne in Rome, signing documents that moved millions of people across the face of the earth. His name was Gaius Octavius. History knows him as Caesar Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, the architect of an empire that stretched from the cold northern shores of Britain to the sun-scorched sands of Egypt, from the Iberian Peninsula in the west to the borders of Persia in the east. He ruled from 27 years before the Common Era until 14 years after it, a reign of over 40 years, unmatched in Roman history for its stability, its reach, and its transformation of the known world. And it was precisely during his reign that a child was born who would outlast him in influence by more than 2,000 years. This is not a coincidence that historians take lightly, nor should we. To understand the weight of this moment, you have to go back. Back before Augustus, back before the empire, back to a Rome that was tearing itself apart. For generations, the Roman Republic had been convulsed by civil war. Great men rose and fell. Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon. Pompey was slain in Egypt. The Senate conspired. Daggers fell. And from the ashes of that political carnage, a young man named Octavian emerged. Quiet, strategic, patient. He was Julius Caesar's adopted son, and he had inherited both a name and a dangerous world. He fought, he maneuvered, he formed alliances and then dissolved them when the moment demanded. He defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium in 31 years before the Common Era. And with that victory, the last rival for supreme power vanished from the earth. Rome was exhausted. Rome was broken. Rome wanted peace, and Octavian gave it to them. By 27 years before the Common Era, the Senate had granted him extraordinary powers, a new name, and a place in history that no Roman had ever occupied. He became Augustus, a word that means the revered one, the sacred one, the one set apart from all other men. He was not called a king. The Romans despised that word. But in practice, he was something more than a king. He was the singular axis around which the entire known world turned. What Augustus built was unlike anything the ancient world had seen. He reorganized the military. He reformed the legal system. He commissioned roads that stretched for hundreds of thousands of miles across the empire, roads that would later carry the feet of apostles and the letters of a movement that had not yet been born. He established a postal system. He reformed the currency. He rebuilt Rome in marble where he had found it in brick. He is reported to have said as much himself, with the quiet pride of a man who understood what he had done. And then there was the census. The historians have documented that Augustus conducted at least 3 major registrations of Roman citizens in 28 years before the Common Era, in 8 years before the Common Era, and in 14 years of the Common Era. But beyond these formal citizen enrollments, there is evidence of broader provincial registrations as well. Empire-wide administrative enumerations that required people to return to their ancestral cities to be counted. It was one such decree, one bureaucratic act in a vast machinery of imperial governance that set in motion a journey from Nazareth to Bethlehem. A journey made by a carpenter and a young woman, carrying something the empire could not have imagined. The historian Orosius, writing centuries later, recorded that Augustus had ordered a census be taken of each province everywhere, that all men be enrolled. And scholars note that around 3 to 2 years before the Common Era, an empire-wide loyalty oath was administered across Roman territories, an enrollment in which millions of subjects were required to declare their allegiance to the emperor. The machinery of the greatest empire in history was running at full power, and in a small corner of that empire, in the province of Judea, 2 travelers arrived in a crowded town and found there was no room for them. But Augustus was not the only ruler whose shadow fell across the birth of Jesus. There was another man, a man closer to Bethlehem, a man who, when he heard what the Eastern astronomers were saying, was not curious. He was afraid. Herod the Great had ruled Judea for nearly 35 years when the Magi arrived in Jerusalem. He was a man of extraordinary construction, the builder of a gleaming new temple in Jerusalem that was considered one of the wonders of the ancient world. He had rebuilt entire cities. He had expanded ports. He had created something magnificent. And he had done it all through paranoia, surveillance, violence, and an iron relationship with Rome. Herod was not Jewish by blood. He was an Idumean, a descendant of a people forcibly converted to Judaism generations before. He was a client king, which meant his authority came not from his people, but from the approval of Rome. He served at the pleasure of Augustus. His crown was a political arrangement, not a birthright, and he knew it. This is the man who had executed members of his own family when he suspected them of threatening his throne. This is the man who had his own sons put to death. Augustus himself, according to ancient sources, is said to have remarked that it was safer to be Herod's pig than Herod's son. So when travelers arrived from the east, asking where the newborn king of the Jews could be found, Herod summoned his chief priests and scholars in an emergency meeting. He needed to know where. He needed to know when. He needed to locate a child who had not yet been identified, who could not yet speak, who was perhaps still learning to walk. And when the Magi departed without returning to him with information, something in Herod's long history of violent decision-making clicked into place. He issued an order to kill every male child in Bethlehem, 2 years old and under. 2 years and under, because that was the window the astronomers had given him. That was the outer boundary of the timeline. And Herod, rather than risk even a single heir of David slipping through his net, expanded the massacre beyond any reasonable military calculation. It was not a rational act. It was the act of a man who understood, at some deep level, that the child he was seeking was not simply a political rival. He was something else entirely. Scholars have long debated the precise date of Jesus' birth, and the debate is genuinely complex. The traditional anchor point has been the death of Herod the Great. Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian, connects Herod's death to a lunar eclipse. For most of the past 2 centuries, that eclipse has been identified as the one occurring on the 13th of March, in 4 years before the Common Era, placing Herod's death in the spring of that year and Jesus' birth somewhere between 6 and 4 years before the Common Era. But a minority of scholars have challenged this, pointing to a lunar eclipse in December of 1 year before the Common Era as a more chronologically consistent candidate. Some researchers place Herod's death in January of 1 year before the Common Era, which would shift the birth of Jesus to around 2 years before the Common Era. What is not in dispute is the broader frame. Jesus was born during the reign of Herod the Great. Herod died before the birth of Jesus' public ministry, and all of this occurred within the long stabilizing arc of Augustus's rule over the Roman Empire. The timeline is clear, even where the precise dates are not. And here is the hidden layer that most tellings of the Nativity skip over entirely. Augustus had, in his lifetime, been declared a divine figure by the Roman Senate. Temples were built to him across the empire. Coins bore his image with the inscription, "Son of God," a title that, in the Roman world, was not metaphorical. It was a formal political designation. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace that Augustus had inaugurated, was proclaimed across the empire as the peace brought by a divine ruler. Roman propaganda announced the birth of Augustus himself as a cosmic event, the arrival of one who would bring harmony to the world, peace to the nations, and the fulfillment of a golden age. And then, into that same world, in a city of no political consequence, in a structure used to shelter animals, a different child was born, with no army, no palace, no coins bearing his face, no official record, no Senate decree in his name. The contrast is not accidental. The Gospel of Luke, written to a Greco-Roman audience deeply familiar with the language of imperial proclamation, opens the birth narrative with deliberate political gravity. Caesar Augustus issues a decree. All the world moves in response. And then Luke pivots, and in the same breath, in the same paragraph, introduces a carpenter and a young woman traveling to a small town no emperor would ever visit. Luke knew exactly what he was doing. He was placing two kingdoms side by side. One vast, armed, and proclaimed, the other invisible, fragile, and whispered into the night sky over shepherds' fields. The Pax Romana created something else too, something that historians have noted with a kind of structural awe. Augustus's road network, his postal infrastructure, his enforced peace across the Mediterranean basin. All of these systems would become, within decades, the literal pathways of a movement that Augustus never imagined and certainly never intended to sponsor. The apostles would walk those Roman roads. The letters of Paul would travel along those postal routes. The Greek language, standardized across the empire by Hellenistic culture, would become the vehicle through which a collection of texts would spread from Jerusalem to Antioch, from Corinth to Rome, from Rome to the edges of the known world. Augustus built the infrastructure of the gospel without knowing it. The roads he paved for legions would carry fishermen. The cities he connected for taxation would become pulpits. The relative peace he imposed by force of arms would create the conditions for ideas to move faster and farther than armies ever had. Many scholars of early Christianity have observed that any other era in ancient history would have been dramatically less favorable for the rapid spread of a movement with no political power, no military force, and no institutional backing. The timing is not incidental. It is structural. And then there is one more layer to this hidden timeline, one that most people never pause to consider. Augustus died in 14 years of the Common Era. Jesus was by then approximately 16 to 18 years old, depending on which birth date you accept. He was living quietly in Nazareth, working as a craftsman, unknown to the empire that had set the terms of his birth. The emperor who had issued the decree that sent his parents to Bethlehem. The man whose administrative machinery had unwittingly fulfilled an ancient prophecy about a birthplace, died without ever knowing the name of the child his census had displaced. Tiberius Caesar became emperor after Augustus, and it would be during Tiberius's reign that Jesus would begin his public ministry, approximately 15 years later. By then, Herod the Great had been dead for more than a decade. A different Herod sat in the north. A Roman governor named Pontius Pilate administered Judea. The political architecture had shifted, but the imperial weight remained the same. The child born during the census of Augustus, in the shadow of Herod's paranoid court, had grown into a man who was about to say things that neither Rome nor Jerusalem was prepared to hear. There is something almost architectural about the way these timelines converge. A man rises from political chaos to unprecedented power. He builds the most stable governmental structure the ancient world has ever seen. He standardizes language. He builds roads. He administers censuses. He enforces peace. And at the precise intersection of all these systems, an event occurs in a stable in Bethlehem that, by any political calculation of the time, should have meant nothing. No one wrote it down in the official records of Rome. No Senate document noted it. No military dispatch carried the news to Augustus. The census that drove the family to Bethlehem recorded only names and numbers, not significance. History from the outside missed it entirely. And yet, here we stand, more than 2,000 years later, still marking time by that birth, still dividing the calendar of the world into the years before it and the years after it. The most powerful man alive when Jesus was born ruled the world for over 40 years. His name was spoken in every province, inscribed on every coin, carved into temple facades from Spain to Syria. And the child born into his empire, into the machinery of his census, in the last year of Herod's paranoid reign, in a town that maps barely bothered to mark, has been spoken about longer. History moves forward, patterns do not lie, empires pass, names fade, roads crumble, and yet the timeline begun in that stable, the one no official hand recorded, continues, not because of armies, not because of emperors, not because any man with power chose it, but because something entered the story that night that the census could not count and the empire could not contain.